Hi, this is your host, Chaplain NC from New Creation Concepts, presenting prophetic principles to inspire vision and revelation. Today, I want to share a segment from The Ultimate Discovery. They have some great inspirational content. They're sharing about Mel Gibson's new project of the sequel of The Passion of the Christ, The Resurrection of Christ. That's coming out, I hear, sometime next year toward Passover season. So I pray you be blessed, and if so, don't forget to like, subscribe to their channel at Ultimate Discovery, as well as yours truly, Chaplain NC here, as I share all kind of inspiring content from different creators here at New Creation Concepts Presents. Thank you so much. I pray you be blessed.
Took a long time to write. It's really ambitious, and it goes from like the fall of the angels to the death of the last apostle.
What does it take to make a film that Hollywood refuses to finance, that critics call dangerous, and that millions of people will see in the first month? In 2004, Mel Gibson found out. And in 2025, he announced he was about to find out again. 7 words that shook Hollywood. On January 9th, 2025, Mel Gibson appeared on the Joe Rogan Experience podcast and, in an interview that stretched for more than 2 hours, revealed the most ambitious film project in the history of Christian cinema. In the announcement, Gibson confirmed that the long-awaited sequel to his 2004 blockbuster, The Passion of the Christ, would be titled The Resurrection of the Christ. The script, he explained, had been in development since at least 2016 and had taken 7 years to write. He collaborated on the screenplay with his brother Donald and Randall Wallace, the Oscar-nominated screenwriter of Braveheart. Gibson described the narrative scope in 7 words that would come to define the project. The story moves from the fall of the angels to the death of the last apostle. He described the script in terms that no filmmaker had ever used for a biblical epic, calling it an acid trip, and adding that he had never read anything like it. Gibson confirmed that Jim Caviezel, who had portrayed Jesus in the original film, would reprise the role. However, he acknowledged a major complication. More than 2 decades had passed since the original film, yet the story of the resurrection takes place just 3 days after the crucifixion. Gibson said he would need to use techniques such as CGI de-aging on Caviezel. He also revealed that the sequel would be filmed in English, unlike the original, which was shot entirely in Aramaic, Hebrew, and Latin. The concepts were so complex, Gibson explained, that having actors speak in ancient languages might be a step too far for audiences trying to absorb the material. The secular press reacted with the same mixture of skepticism and fascination that had greeted the original film 2 decades earlier. Critics called it fringe, controversial, and dangerous. But Gibson had heard all of that before, and he was prepared to do it again. To understand what he was attempting, one must first understand what he had already done. How did a man Hollywood blacklisted become the only filmmaker willing to bet everything on the most controversial religious film ever made? Before the resurrection. In February 2004, Mel Gibson released a film that the entire Hollywood establishment had told him would fail. The Passion of the Christ was shot entirely in dead languages that no mainstream audience has ever had to endure for a feature film. It featured no major stars, and the violence was graphic and disturbing. Industry executives worried about the allegations of anti-Semitism that had dogged the production. Fearing that the movie would never find an audience, every major Hollywood studio refused to finance or distribute it. Through his production company, Icon Productions, Gibson put up $30 million of his own money to fund the movie. The film was released on Ash Wednesday, February 25th, 2004, in more than 3,000 theaters across North America. Over its theatrical run, The Passion of the Christ earned well over $600 million worldwide on that $30 million budget. Of that total, $370,800,000 came from the United States and Canada alone. It became the highest-grossing R-rated film in domestic box office history, a record it held for 20 years until Disney's Deadpool and Wolverine surpassed it in 2024. It was also the highest-grossing independent film ever made, and the highest-grossing non-English language film of all time until it was surpassed in 2017. Adjusted for inflation, The Passion of the Christ remains one of the top 50 highest-grossing films in American history. The film's success went beyond money. It reshaped culture. 70 million people saw it in the first month alone. It received 3 Academy Award nominations. But, while some reviewers praised its intensity and craftsmanship, others were appalled. In fact, the controversy extended well beyond film criticism, as major Hollywood figures were said to be so appalled by the film's allegedly anti-Semitic portrayal of Jewish authorities that they would no longer work with Gibson. Industry insiders even predicted his career was ruined. But Gibson's faith was not a convenient marketing angle. It was the animating force behind everything he did. He was raised in a traditionalist Catholic household, the 11th of 11 children. As an adult, he embraced his faith fully, describing himself as deeply Christian in his beliefs and trusting Scripture completely. On the Joe Rogan podcast, he pointed to extra-biblical historical accounts that confirmed the existence of Jesus of Nazareth. He pointed to the apostles' willingness to die rather than renounce their belief, arguing that nobody dies for a lie. When Rogan asked whether Gibson actually believed the resurrection happened as a real event, the director's answer was unequivocal. He posed the question of who gets back up 3 days after being murdered in public, noting that Buddha did not do that. The theological framework Gibson has embraced for this sequel is very ambitious. The story will cover the fall of the angels, the rebellion of Lucifer that introduced evil into creation, and the cosmic war that has raged ever since. It will depict Christ's descent into Sheol, the Hebrew realm of the dead, between the crucifixion and the resurrection. This event, known in Christian theology as the harrowing of hell, is rooted in Scripture. The first epistle of Peter, chapter 3, verses 19 through 20, speaks of Christ making proclamation to the imprisoned spirits. Paul's letter to the Ephesians, chapter 4, verses 8 through 10, questions what the ascension means, except that he also descended to the lower, earthly regions. The doctrine is also affirmed in the Apostles' Creed, which states plainly that Christ descended into hell. The harrowing of hell is more than a descent into darkness. It is victory. In the tradition that developed over centuries, Christ descended into the realm of the dead, broke down its gates, and released the captives. Adam and Eve, the righteous men and women of the Old Testament, all who had died before his coming. Then the concept of Sheol itself evolved during the Second Temple period, the era between 516 BCE and 70 CE, when Jewish cosmology developed a more complex understanding of the afterlife. Sheol was understood as a subterranean underworld, where the souls of the dead went after the body died, and some scholars came to believe it was divided into multiple compartments, where individuals were assigned based on moral worthiness. Most Christian films skip over this entirely and just compress the 3 days between Good Friday and Easter Sunday into a jump cut and a sunrise. But the reason why Gibson is building an entire act around them comes from a theological conversation between Gibson and his screenwriter, Randall Wallace. The two had just finished promoting Hacksaw Ridge, their World War II epic about the conscientious objector Desmond Doss. Wallace, a Baptist, noted the theological divide he had observed between Catholic and Protestant traditions, that in Catholicism there was far more emphasis on the crucifixion and the Passion, while Protestants tended to focus on the empty cross and the victory of the resurrection. Gibson grew quiet and listened intently. Once Wallace offered to begin work on the screenplay, Gibson told him directly that he would have a Catholic Mass said for him. Then he issued a warning that Satan was going to come after Wallace. Wallace, unfazed, quipped back that Satan already had so many Baptists that he probably would not even notice one more. But Gibson was serious. He knew from his own experience making The Passion of the Christ that telling this story carried spiritual weight. Wallace later recalled that Gibson emphasized the project could not be about money or proving anything to anyone. Their hearts, Gibson insisted, had to be pure. But a film is not made on faith alone. It requires cameras, locations, budgets, and crews. It requires the machinery of production. What would it take to bring this Mount Everest of stories to the screen? $200 million of faith. On October 6, 2025, principal photography began at Cinecittà Studios in Rome, the legendary facility where Gibson had filmed portions of the original Passion of the Christ more than 2 decades earlier. Manuela Cacciamani, the chief executive of Cinecittà Studios, confirmed the production timeline months in advance, noting that the film would be shot entirely at the historic Roman studios and surrounding Italian locations. The production spread across multiple regions of southern Italy, encompassing both Basilicata and Puglia. The primary locations included the Parco della Murgia Materana in Matera, the same area that had served Gibson so effectively in the original film. Additional shooting took place in the towns of Genosa, Gravina, in Puglia, Brindisi, and Krakow, with some sequences shot between Rome and Anzio. These locations, characterized by their rocky formations, caves, and Mediterranean landscapes, were chosen to recreate key settings from the biblical narrative. The Parco della Murgia Materana had previously been used in religious cinema, including scenes from The Passion of the Christ in 2004, and Pier Paolo Pasolini's The Gospel, according to St. Matthew. The technical ambition of the production matched its geographical scope. Gibson chose to shoot at least some sequences using IMAX cameras, a format reserved for films where the screen needs to be as large as the story. The decision signaled a wide IMAX release in 2027. The budget for the two-part epic was confirmed at $200 million, with each film carrying a budget in the $100 million region. Those numbers were exceptionally rare in the independent market. Some later reports suggested the budget had climbed as high as $250 million. The budget increase from the original $30 million production was attributed directly to the film's content. The depiction of Christ's descent into hell and the fall of the angels required a lot of work. The scale was reflected in the extensive visual effects and makeup departments, with several artists working to create the transformative looks required for a story spanning millennia. The secrecy surrounding the project was unusually tight. In an unusual move for an independent film in production, buyers at the American film market were not being allowed to read the scripts ahead of time. It was not even clear whether they would be able to do so during the market, despite the expected large requests for territory. Despite the secrecy, industry interest remained high. One buyer told Deadline that the project sold itself and described it as gold in terms of the material. The creative challenge of depicting heaven, hell, and Sheol on screen was immense. Gibson had acknowledged this difficulty from the beginning, telling Joe Rogan that the key was finding a way in that was not cheesy or too obvious. Gibson himself acknowledged the difficulty, admitting he was not wholly sure he could pull it off. Yet he remained determined to try, describing the project as his life's work and a mission he had carried for more than 20 years. But even as the production gathered momentum, a crisis was building behind the scenes. The face of Jesus. The plan to bring Jim Caviezel back as Jesus had been set in motion long before production began. As recently as April 2025, Caviezel had told the Arroyo Grande podcast that he was preparing to return, expressing both eagerness and the familiar fear he had carried on the original production. Fans were ready, then everything changed. As pre-production progressed through the summer of 2025, the reality of de-aging Caviezel proved far too expensive. Multiple negotiations and discussions took place before the production was forced to accept the inevitable. The original cast would not return. Gibson didn't make the call easily. He had wanted Caviezel back, but the numbers did not work. Caviezel was 57 years old, and the story required a Jesus who had been crucified at 33 and resurrected just 3 days later. In the end, Gibson made the difficult choice to recast the entire film, rather than compromise the production with expensive digital trickery. The new ensemble would feature Finnish actor Jaakko Otonen as Jesus, replacing Caviezel. Cuban actress Mariela Garriga would take over as Mary Magdalene from Monica Bellucci. The announcement of the recasting made fans erupt in fury. Social media erupted with criticism from believers who had connected deeply with Caviezel's portrayal and could not imagine anyone else in the role. One fan wrote on X that recasting Jesus was blasphemous work. Another expressed sympathy for Caviezel, noting that he had been talking about this film since 2012. The criticism extended beyond Caviezel's absence to questions about representation, with many users questioning why a Finnish actor had been chosen to play a Middle Eastern figure. Jaakko Ootinen, the actor stepping into this maelstrom of expectation and criticism, was a relative unknown. Born on August 25, 1989, in Oulu, Finland, Ootinen had trained at the University of Tampere, graduating with a Master of Theatre Arts in 2015. He had appeared in Finnish television productions and films, and had a small role as the Danish warrior Woland in the 5th season of Netflix's historical epic, The Last Kingdom. He was 36 years old at the time of casting, the same approximate age as Jesus at the time of his death. He had never carried out a project of this scale, or been subjected to the global scrutiny that would come with playing one of the most recognizable figures in human history. Gibson and his team had a theological justification that matched the practical one. The Jesus of the resurrection is not the Jesus of the crucifixion. He is transfigured, glorified, unrecognizable. In the Gospel of Luke, chapter 24, verses 15 through 16, the disciples walked with the resurrected Christ for miles without recognizing him. In the Gospel of John, chapter 20, verses 14 through 15, Mary Magdalene mistook him for a gardener. A new actor, Gibson and his team argued, was theologically appropriate. The crew kept working, and when they finally wrapped, Gibson gathered them together to say what he had been holding inside for more than 2 decades. An accomplished mission. On April 30th, 2026, principal photography on the resurrection of the Christ had officially wrapped ahead of schedule after 134 days of filming. When Lionsgate announced the completion of principal photography a month later, they also informed the public of major changes to the release schedule. Part 1, originally slated for Good Friday, March 26, 2027, was pushed back to Ascension Day, May 6, 2027. Part 2, which had been scheduled for May 6, 2027, was moved a full year to May 25, 2028. Both films would now open on Ascension Day, the Christian holiday commemorating the ascension of Jesus into heaven. Deadline reported that the studio felt the original dates were too close together, given the scale of the productions. Opening on Ascension Day positioned each film within the prime summer box office window. By moving the release dates to Ascension Day, Gibson and Lionsgate were also sending a theological message that this story was not about death attributed to Good Friday, but rather the victory and triumph that Ascension Day is all about. Alongside the release date announcement, Lionsgate unveiled the first official image from the production. The production still depicted Finnish actor Jaakko Ootinen, who had taken over the role of Jesus Christ from Jim Caviezel, leading a crowd atop a hill. The image showed Ootinen in period costume with long hair, positioned at the forefront on a mountainous hillside. It was the public's first opportunity to see the new Jesus and assess the visual direction of the film. The full cast was also confirmed, including Mariella Garriga as Mary Magdalene, Pierluigi Pacino as Peter, Kasia Smutniak as Mary, Riccardo Scamarcio as Pontius Pilate, and Rupert Everett in an undisclosed role. Gibson's statement accompanying the announcement was deeply personal. He expressed profound gratitude to his cast and crew, describing the production as a shared labor of love. He acknowledged that the film represented a major part of his life's work and had demanded everything of him as a filmmaker and as an artist. He also highlighted the importance of reuniting with many of his original collaborators from The Passion of the Christ, describing them as true masters of their craft, who had allowed him to bring the story to the screen exactly as he had envisioned it. Lionsgate chairman Adam Fogelson praised the production in his own statement, calling Gibson a true visionary with an artist's eye for scale and a storyteller's instinct for emotional truth. He said every image they had seen from the set felt like a masterwork painting brought to life, and noted that there were very few directors who could operate at that level of epic spectacle, while simultaneously delivering such depth and conviction. With principal photography complete, the production entered post-production. Gibson would now oversee the editing, visual effects, and scoring. The visual effects work would be extensive, given the film's graphic depictions. The scoring was expected to be handled by John Debney, who had received an Academy Award nomination for his score for The Passion of the Christ. The post-production timeline would determine whether the first part would arrive in theaters on time for Ascension Day in 2027. The distribution network for the film was expansive. Lionsgate secured a sprawling global distribution network spanning North America, Europe, Africa, Asia, and Australasia, positioning the film as a truly international event. The Vatican's reaction to the production remained silent. Gibson had been consulting with Archbishop Carlo Maria Vigano, the former Vatican ambassador to the United States. The Vatican excommunicated Vigano in 2024 after he refused to recognize Pope Francis's authority, publicly calling the Pope a servant of Satan and a false prophet in a series of increasingly incendiary statements. Gibson's association with Vigano had generated major controversy during production, but the Vatican had not issued any official statement regarding the film or Gibson's collaboration with the excommunicated Archbishop. Gibson was not delivering his epic into the same world that had rejected the Passion of the Christ 2 decades earlier. What had changed, and why was the world finally ready for a film like this? A world made ready. When Gibson stopped filming, he didn't know he was about to deliver a film into a culture that had been preparing for its arrival. Faith-based entertainment had changed so dramatically that Gibson's 2027 epic would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. The most visible sign of this transformation was The Chosen, the crowd-funded television series about the life of Jesus that had become a global phenomenon. Since its debut in 2017, the show has reached audiences in 175 countries and surpassed 280 million viewers worldwide through streaming platforms and broadcast partners. More recent figures place the audience even higher, with some reports indicating the series had exceeded 308 million viewers. The show had accumulated more than 900 million episode views across 175 countries. In February 2026, The Chosen was officially recognized for the second time by Guinness World Records as the most translated television series in history. But a third of the show's viewers were not even religious. Beyond streaming platforms, personal lives are impacted too. In April 2024, the actor and comedian Russell Brand was baptized in the River Thames by the television adventurer Bear Grylls. Brand, who had been accused of rape, assault, and emotional abuse in September 2023, allegations he consistently denied, described the baptism as an opportunity to leave the past behind and leave behind the sins. The Joe Rogan podcast had also become an unlikely platform for faith-based conversation. Rogan, whose show was one of the most listened-to podcasts on the planet, had spent increasing amounts of airtime discussing Christianity and spirituality. In October 2025, Rogan revealed that he had been attending church and genuinely enjoyed it. He described his time visiting a local congregation as thought-provoking and inspiring as he considered the claims of Christ. He called Jesus Christ the best example of what a human should strive to be. He pushed back on the common secular claim that biblical stories were mere mythology, saying there was something to it and a reason why it resonated with people. In January 2025, he had hosted Christian apologist Wesley Huff for an extensive conversation about faith, Jesus, and the supernatural claims of the Bible. In May 2025, he questioned the Big Bang and said, "Jesus makes more sense." The same platform that had hosted conversations about psychedelics and conspiracy theories was now hosting extended discussions about the historicity of the Gospels and the theological significance of the harrowing of hell. The shift went beyond Hollywood. Generation Z, the least religious cohort in American history, was showing signs of reconsidering religion. A new report from the Bible Society called The Quiet Revival started to challenge the idea that Christian faith was waning. Based on surveys of 18 to 24-year-olds, only 4% told YouGov they were Christian and went to church at least once a month in 2022. By 2024, that figure had risen to 16%, and a year later, the typical Gen Z churchgoer attended services nearly every weekend a month, the highest level since tracking began, and a 100% increase from 2020 levels. A Gallup poll released in April 2025 revealed a staggering rise in religious importance among young males. Approximately 42% of young men reported that religion was very important to them, up sharply from 28% in 2023. Bible sales in 2025 surged past 10 million copies, already over 1 million more than in 2024. Faith-based films were performing remarkably well at the box office. In 2025, the animated biblical film King of Kings grossed $45 million in 10 days and earned more than $83 million globally, surpassing The Prince of Egypt. Hollywood was finally recognizing that faith-based audiences were not a niche demographic to be ignored, but a massive, underserved market with enormous spending power. The largest project in the pipeline was Gibson's two-part epic. Using the standard 2.5 times multiplier rule for Hollywood productions, Gibson's two-part epic would need to earn a combined worldwide total of $500 million to break even at the box office. Even if each of the two films earned 25 to 30% less than their predecessor, their combined global total was expected to comfortably surpass the $500 million break-even target. But the numbers and celebrities only tell half the story. There was a deeper story that Gibson had been telling all along. The Last Eyewitness. Of the 12 apostles, only one is traditionally believed to have died of natural causes, John, the son of Zebedee. If the story covers every apostle's death before reaching John, Gibson's cameras would have to depict a relentless procession of martyrdoms. John's own brother James was the first apostolic martyr, beheaded by Herod Agrippa in Jerusalem around 44 AD. John outlived him by roughly 6 decades, surviving into the reign of the Roman Emperor Trajan and dying around 100 AD at an advanced age of approximately 93 or 94. As for the remaining original 10 apostles, Peter was crucified upside down in Rome during the persecution of Nero. Andrew was crucified on an X-shaped cross in Patras, Greece. Thomas was impaled with a spear in India. Philip was crucified in Hierapolis, Asia Minor. Bartholomew was flayed alive and then beheaded in Armenia. Matthew was martyred in Ethiopia. James the Less was stoned to death in Jerusalem. Simon the Zealot was martyred in Persia. Jude Thaddeus was killed with arrows. And of course, Judas Iscariot died by suicide. The reason John lived so long while the others perished is rooted in a saying of Jesus recorded in the Gospel of John, chapter 21, verses 22 and 23. When Peter asked about John's fate, Jesus replied that if he wanted John to remain until he came, that was none of Peter's business. This cryptic statement sparked a rumor among the early believers that John would never die. The rumor persisted for generations, but the settled tradition of the church is that John did eventually die peacefully in Ephesus. John did not escape persecution entirely. According to tradition, he was arrested and brought to Rome, where authorities sentenced him to death by being plunged into a cauldron of boiling oil in front of spectators. Miraculously, John emerged completely unharmed. Some versions of the story say many spectators converted on the spot. The Roman ruler, embarrassed and furious, banished John instead to the small Greek island of Patmos. It was there that John received the vision he transcribed in the book of Revelation. After his banishment ended, John returned to Ephesus, where he lived out his remaining years, died of natural causes, and was buried. His grave at Ephesus became a place of pilgrimage. Theologically, John was preserved to write the gospel that most explicitly declares Jesus' divinity, the letters that define love as God's essence, and the revelation that unveils the cosmic victory already won. If the film truly ends with John's death, the final act would not be the resurrection or even the ascension. It would be John, alone among the 12, writing his gospel and his letters in Ephesus, the last living bridge to the earthly Jesus, until his final breath in Ephesus marked the moment when the story passed from history into faith. And that, Gibson believes, is the story the world needs to hear. Thanks for watching. Now, check out the videos popping up on screen for more unbelievable stories.